Good afternoon, everyone. For those who just entered the session, my name is Tong Mu, and I'm a PhD student at Princeton University. Thanks again for coming to our symposium. Well, as a last speaker in the session, I'll talk about part of my PhD thesis looking at the disproportionate importance of the upper tidal flats to the conservation of migratory shorebirds. Well, this bar chart here with the x-axis shows the total tidal flat, total area of the tidal flat, and the y-axis shows the years, suggested, as many of you have already heard, that from 1980s to the 2000s, the tidal flats in the Yellow Sea has declined at an annual rate of 1.2%. And all of us are well aware that the major cause of shorebird declines along the East Asian-Australasian Flyway has been attributed to such rapid loss of the tidal flats, primarily in the Yellow Sea region shown on the right here, which is a major hub for migratory shorebirds. Well, but we also see that for many species with significant declining trend shown on the right here, almost all of them experienced a much faster decline than the rate of habitat loss, and some of which more than tenfold higher. So the question is, if habitat loss is the major threat that leads to the decline of shorebird populations, why is there such discrepancy between the rate of population decline and the rate of habitat loss? And maybe other threats like hunting or climate change have contributed to this discrepancy, as has been talked about during other sessions. But can habitat loss itself lead to such discrepancy? For example, if one part of the mudflat is more valuable for shorebirds, then a small amount of habitat loss of this area may indeed have a drastic population consequences. And if that's the case, how should we better conserve those species? So to answer these questions, we conducted shorebird survey at two of the most important sites in the north and southern part of the Yellow Sea in China, namely Nanpu in the north and Rudong in the south. And at those two sites, we set out these transects covering the entire segment of the entire elevational gradient of the tidal flat to quantify their spatial distribution. And we also did so throughout the entire tidal cycle to look at their temporal changes. And this is what the data looks like. It's a little bit complicated. I'll just go over in detail with you. So on the x-axis is the distance from the seawall, and on the y-axis is the time since high tide in minutes. So this is high tide, low tide, and then another high tide. And each of these blue dots here, the size of these dots represents how many birds, in this case kentish plover, are feeding at a given segment at a given time of the tidal cycle. And these red colors mean that we did the observation, but no bird was seen. And these blue triangles illustrated approximately when and where these plots are underwater. So based on our field observations and existing literature, we proposed that there were at least 3 basic types of foraging distribution in shorebirds, which I will talk about soon. So this kentish plover at Rudong was identified as a generalist, meaning that they forage whenever and wherever the mudflat is exposed. As you can see, that the dots are pretty much evenly spread across the time and across the space in this figure. So to quantitatively define and identify these foraging patterns, we developed a test of the centroid positions for these birds. And we can see here that during high tide, all these birds are packed in a small area of the exposed mudflat. And the centroid of these birds will be also very close to the seawall or close to the high tide line. And then when the tide recedes further, the centroid will also move further from the seawall. And then during low tide, when all the mudflat is exposed, then centroid will only be at the middle of the mudflat for the generalist because they're evenly spread across the entire tidal flat. And then when the tide starts to come in, the position of the centroid mostly mirrors what happened during the receding tide and getting closer and closer to the seawall. So if we plot this proportion of the tidal flat exposed on the x-axis and the position of the centroid on the y-axis. For this generalist, we should get a straight line of a slope close to 0.5 because the centroid will start off pretty close to the seawall when a small portion of the mudflat or during the high tide, but they will only approach the middle point of the mudflat when the entire tidal flat is exposed. And then the second type that we identified is called the upper zone specialist. As the name suggests, that these Terrex sandpipers at Nampu stay pretty close to the seawall and only uses this upper part of the tidal flat, even when all the mudflat is exposed, which is evident by this lack of observations on the right side of this plot. So if we look at the position of the centroid, we can see again that the centroid starts off pretty close to the seawall. And when the tide recedes, it will stay very close to the seawall until the tide covers the upper tidal zone. So for the upper zone specialist on the centroid plot, what we get is a segmented relationship. The centroid will move away from the seawall at first, but at some point, they will remain relatively unchanged because the bird remains at the upper tidal flat even when the entire tidal flat is exposed. And then the third type that we identified is called the tide follower, indicating that this species track the tidal movement closely and they choose the area that's freshly exposed, like here, or the place that's about to be covered, shown by these plots concentrated at the edge of the plot. And then the centroid will also stay very close to the moving tidal front. Thus, on this plot of the centroid positions, the centroid, as a bird, will just follow the tidal front. And it will move very close to the lower end of the tidal flat when the entire tidal flat is exposed, leading to this straight line of a slope close to 1. And indeed, for the 17 species that we have enough data on, we were able to group most of them into the 3 types we proposed. And we found that these patterns, these foraging patterns, are not surprisingly species-specific, meaning that different species, as we talked about, may exhibit different foraging patterns at the same site. And we can see here that the gray plovers and Kentish plovers are identified as zone specialists, while sanderlings and downlings are tide followers, and the Terrex sandpipers are zone specialists at Nampu. But we also found that these patterns are site-specific. That is, the same species may exhibit different patterns at different sites. We see that gray plovers and Kentish plovers are generalists at Rudong, contrary to the zone specialist at Nampu, while downlings changed from a tide follower to a zone specialist at Nampu, but Terrex sandpiper stays as a zone specialist at both sites. And now that we got their distribution pattern throughout the tidal cycle, we then want to quantify the importance of each segment of the tidal flat for foraging shorebirds. And we would argue that, as Jimmy also mentioned, that the importance of the tidal flats depends not only on the number of birds using the area, but how long they spend foraging in the area. And the longer the area exposed, the more opportunity for birds to forage in those areas. For example, if we look at these 2 segments here, on average, they seem to have a similar number of birds feeding in those areas at a specific given time. But what we would argue is that because this segment on the left is exposed for longer periods throughout the tidal cycle, it provides more food and contributes more to the feeding of the shorebirds. Thus, it's more important for shorebirds. So after we calculated this, what we call the cumulative foraging time for each of these segments of the tidal flat, which takes into consideration both how many birds are foraging and how long they spend foraging in the area. We can see that the upper tidal flats, shown by this yellow box here, provides more than 75% of the total foraging time for generalists on average. And similarly, the upper tidal flat is also the most important segment for upper zone specialists, which should be quite evident because that's basically the only area they use. but the only exception is tide followers. These three different parts are used relatively equally for tide followers because they're just following the tide. They don't stay at a specific segment for extended period. So it turned out that for this first question, the answer is that the tidal flats are indeed heterogeneous in their value to migratory shorebirds. The upper tidal zone, as Misha has already told you sometimes, is the most valuable part of the mudflat, which provides a major feeding opportunity for most of the shorebirds, and at least at two of these major stopover sites in the Yellow Sea. And it's not difficult to imagine that losing the upper tidal zone, although a small area compared to the entire tidal flats, can be extremely detrimental. As Misha mentioned, that this 5% of spartina encroachment may be disproportionately detrimental to the feeding or the foraging for shorebirds because they occur at upper tidal flats. Then the question is whether the more valuable upper tidal flats are indeed disappearing faster than the others. And the answer is very likely yes. Misha has shown you the example for spartina, but we don't have any quantitative data yet on the loss of habitat, on the loss of mudflat due to land reclamation. But it's not difficult to imagine that this part is indeed the most vulnerable part of the intertidal habitat because they're closer to the land, higher in elevation, thus logistically and economically easier to be reclaimed. And we can see this process in the satellite image of the Tong Mu Dongtan Nature Reserve at the mouth of the Yangtze River. These colors of the line represents when the seawall was built from 1968 in yellow and 2015 in white. And we can see this encroachment from landward to seaward is pretty evident here. And indeed, except for some rare occasions, reclamation usually starts from taking away the upper tidal flats. So although it's a very soft yes at the moment, the upper tidal flats is not only the most valuable part for shorebirds, but it is also and has been the most vulnerable part to habitat loss. And given its results, how should we better conserve the tidal flats for shorebirds? Well, simply speaking, this effective and proactive conservation planning relies on sound ecological understanding of the system. In this study, we showed that there were at least 3 different foraging types exhibited by shorebirds, namely generalists, upper zone specialists, and tide followers. We showed that these patterns are species and site-specific, so should conservation planning. They should also be species and site-specific. And based on this distribution pattern, we showed the upper tidal zone are disproportionately valuable and vulnerable, indicating that the tidal flats are spatially and temporally heterogeneous. And losing a small part of this valuable habitat can lead to drastic population consequences. In other words, in conservation, not only the size of the habitat matters, so does habitat quality. So we should strive to protect the most valuable upper tidal flats and prevent any new reclamation of the existing mudflat, because any of the new reclamation will likely affect upper tidal flats and birds first. Well, in addition to that, there were indeed many other knowledge gaps in our understanding in the shorebird ecology along the Flyway. For example, why the number of shorebirds, habitat size, and quality still changes without land reclamation after land reclamation has been mostly banned in the Yellow Sea. And also, what are the diets, the habitat requirements, and as Gio mentioned, the molting strategies or the migration strategies in general of the many threatened species. Without these important ecological insights, it will be really tough to deliver feasible conservation and practical conservation practices for the protection of shorebirds along the Flyway. Well, this part of my work has been recently published in Proceedings B, and you can find the more technical details there. And we also prepared 2 popular articles, both in English and Mandarin, introducing our work, which might be helpful to deliver the important conservation messages in non-technical language if you're interested. Well, with that, I'd like to take the chance to thank my field assistants, collaborators, lab mates, as well as the funding resources who make the study possible. And thank you for your attention. Happy to take any questions.